Welcome. My name is Steve, and I'm with the Move to Assurance Ministry. And today is part 3 of our look at the question, what is biblical government? In part 1, we learned that government is a minister of God, and it has a ministry of justice, and government can use force to accomplish that. The government has the power of the sword. The church, on the other hand, has a ministry of mercy and salvation, and has the power of God's word. We also learned that there is a third human institution that God has established, the family, and we'll get into that later today. So today we welcome back Doug Lundeen. Doug is an expert on both the Bible and biblical government. Welcome back, Doug. We're glad you could join us for another session today. We're going to start today by jumping into a big question. We've talked a lot about the government and church. Let's finish that up. What about the separation of church and state? Are they supposed to be separate?
Of course.
Thank you. All right, we're done for today.
So let's talk about that a little bit. And again, I've been drawing a lot from the Old Testament, from the law, and from Israel's example. And I want to go here because this is something that most people, I don't think, have thought about in the context of church and state with Israel. Because most people kind of take what I'll call the Sunday school answer, that Israel was a theocracy without thinking about it, okay? And what I mean by that is that Israel itself had a separation of church and state. So let me describe what I mean by that. What do we mean by the separation of church and state? Well, fundamentally, the best example or the best way to talk about that in the context of Israel was that the king was separate from, and the tribal leaders were separate from the priesthood. The priesthood, those who could be priests, had to come from one tribe. It wasn't open to the manipulation of the king, right? In fact, this is one of the problems that Jeroboam instituted in the northern kingdom later. So when God set up Israel and the law was put into place, the priests were to come from the tribe of Levi, and not only from the tribe of Levi, but they were all to be descendants of Aaron. And so the kings couldn't decide or to make their own priests. It's not like the Middle Ages where kings could appoint their own cardinals, okay? So Israel had a separation in terms of even who could be a priest. And none of the priests were ever kings. In fact, ultimately, God said that the kings would come from the tribe of Judah. And so there was a separation almost on a family basis between the church and the state in the Old Testament, or between the religious leadership and the civil leadership in Israel. Now, that leadership was also economically separate. So the priests were not funded by the kings, okay? They had their own source of funding. They were given their own land, their own cities. They were given the tithe. They could eat from some of the, not all, but some of the offerings they could eat from. And so their funding, how they made their living, if you will, was not dependent on the king. And in fact, this is an interesting contrast because we know in ancient times that was not the case. So for example, if we go back and we look at the example of Pharaoh in Egypt, what we see is that the priests in Egypt were all beholden to Pharaoh because they ate at Pharaoh's table, so to speak. And we see this same thing later with Jezebel and Ahab. When we're looking at the prophets, that Jezebel, the prophets of Baal, that Jezebel brought into the land, the Bible again says that they all ate at Jezebel's table, right? They were dependent for their livelihood, for their support on the king. And so in Israel, that was not to be the case. The church or the religious leadership was to be completely independent of the civil authority. The civil authority couldn't appoint them. The civil authority didn't control their livelihood. And so they were, in fact, independent.
That's very different from how we think of separation of church and state.
That's right. All right. And so now, let's go the other way. clearly God intended for the priesthood and the Levites to be counselors to the king. And I mentioned earlier in one of the previous segments about how David would go and inquire of, of God, right? And he would do that through the ministry of the priest. But David was never obligated, was never, quote unquote, forced to do what the priest told him. And so, in fact, we see this later on where priests and prophets would give advice to the kings, and then the kings would basically reject it.
So today, part of the role of the church would be to advise the government on whether they're biblical or not, I guess.
Right. Yeah. In other words, how is a government going to know what's right, what is evil, and what is good, right? And the only way it's going to know that is through this ministry of the Word. And that's the ministry of the church. The church has no power to force the civil government to do A, B, or C, right? But it should be providing counsel.
The government actually should be seeking that counsel, because the church doesn't have the authority to intrude and say, you have to listen to us.
Right.
So the government should seek that. And
right, and to be fair, right, throughout history, especially ever since Constantine, there's been this tension between the church and the state. I mean, you had a period in time where the popes declared the right to anoint kings or declare who would be king, and then you had it turned around where there were times where kings were declaring who would be popes, and so on and so forth. So there's always been this tension as we've tried to work this out. And I would argue that it really did kind of reach, in terms of the resolution of that, it really reached its zenith in the founding of America, in the First Amendment that separates the church and state in terms of that. And if you look at it, what it really is talking about is it's trying to protect the church from the state. So the First Amendment is a limitation on the state, not a limitation on the church.
Another question about the relationship between the church and the state. We talked about the state wielding the sword. It executes justice. The church is the source of mercy. It wields the sword of God's word. What about charity? Is it the government's job to provide welfare? Is it the government's job to be the source of charity?
Well, now you've opened up another can of worms.
Well, we like to open up cans of worms.
Well, again, the only way I know how to answer that is, again, from a scriptural perspective. What did God do in Israel? Right? And in Israel, charity was not done. First of all, charity was not coerced. All right? The second thing that means then is it wasn't done, it wasn't taken care of through the state, through the civil government. It was actually administered by the religious leaders, by the Levites. And so in Israel, the way it worked was people brought their tithes. In those days, right, it wasn't a credit card. It was they brought their animals, they brought a tenth of their crops, whatever, right, to store cities where these things would be stored, and then those things could be administered to those who needed it, whenever they needed it. And so it was administered through the church. And if you look back in history, that was true by and large up until the 20th century in the United States. So charity was oftentimes managed either through voluntary associations before the 1930s, or it was managed through the church. And the thing about that is it meant more freedom, right? Because the government wasn't coercing people. And so we actually had more liberty as a result of that. And there were constraints. I mean, one of the things that we see today is that there are no constraints on what the civil government can promise. See, in Israel, it was self-controlled. And what I mean by that is because what they brought with their tithes, and they didn't bring a credit card, right? What they brought with their tithes were real physical things. They could never give out more to the poor than what they had.
Yeah.
right? They could never borrow from the future to take care of the present. And so it constrained them in terms of how they gave. And going back to something we talked about earlier, people, because it was voluntary, the tithe itself was voluntary, bad people would not give their tithe, right?
Yeah.
But God held them accountable as a people. And so one of the things they should have done as a society is really inculcate in the young that they have this responsibility to give. And therefore, then they would have not been judged by God for failing to give. Yeah. All right? And certainly the poor are harmed when people don't give what they ought to give. Right? But God, in his wisdom, never said, well, the solution to the bad people who won't give is to send the government there with a gun to take it away from them. Because at the end of the day, charity can only be voluntary.
It's not charity otherwise.
Right. Otherwise, what's happening is I'm being charitable with your money.
Yeah.
Right? So, in charity is an individual thing, and it's something that we're held accountable to by God, but government's never given the authority to hold us accountable for charity.
Okay, I've got another can of worms for you, if you feel like dealing with worms today. What about education? Where does that reside?
Okay. Well, first of all, that probably leads into the other topic, which is the family, right? And so the family is where the education of children is expected to take place. And again, we have to remember things were different. There are similarities and things are different. So in ancient Israel, Israel was an agrarian economy. And so what would happen there is Junior would grow up on the farm, if I can use that term, and he would learn to be a farmer or a sheep herder or whatever the family was. Today, our society is much more complicated. And so vocational training, in other words, how we're going to earn a living, we delegate that to other people. And we just have a much wider range of things we can choose to do. If I don't want to be a farmer, if Dad's a farmer and I don't want to be a farmer, I don't have to be a farmer. But Dad has the responsibility to make sure that I have the opportunity to learn what it is I want to do. And it's his responsibility, not the state's.
So it's the responsibility of the family, but somebody else could be doing the education. But it's the family's responsibility to be sure that education is happening.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, there is one example in Scripture of the state doing educating. And the example has to do, I think I can't remember now for sure which king it is. It might be Jehoshaphat. I'd have to go back and do some recovery of that memory. But the state supports the education of people as to what the law is. And so it would have a legitimate responsibility to teach us what the laws require. Okay? It's not a vocational teaching. It's more of a legal teaching, right? What are the laws that we're expected to obey? And so it can have that kind of a responsibility to make sure that we know what the state is going to hold us accountable for.
Yeah.
Right?
Makes sense. Yeah.
But not a vocational training, not what I'll call a general educational training, learning how to read, write, do basic arithmetic, those kinds of things. That's all part of the family's responsibility to prepare their children to be adults.
So that could be done through homeschooling. Are public schools then okay? It seems like public schools are just people getting together and saying, we as a group educate our children.
It might have used to kind of be that way because public schools were controlled locally.
Yeah.
That's not true anymore. Public schools are controlled by the state and by the federal government. And so it's not a local decision anymore where a bunch of families got together and say, we're all going to contribute.
That would have been like a local school board, but now they are overruled in a sense.
Right, because so much of their funding comes from elsewhere, right? And so in the Bible, there was never an expectation that my neighbor had a responsibility to help me educate my children. Okay? And so it was a family responsibility. But this whole idea of public education has morphed into this idea of what I'm going to call indoctrination. And there's a couple of views. One is people will argue, well, what about the family that doesn't care enough about their children to actually educate them, right? And then the other one is the fear of, or the argument that gets made is, well, they're just going to educate their children to believe X, Y, Z, and we don't believe X, Y, Z, so that's harmful to society at large. But at the end of the day, that's a loss of liberty. And so we have the responsibility to educate our children, and it's not the responsibility of the state. And it didn't used to be. In America, it was not the responsibility of the state until the 1830s and 40s. And in fact, one of the major motivators for doing that was because since education up to that point was left up to the families and to the churches, and it was very much more religious than it is today, the actual purpose of it was to reduce the amount of religious education that was going on.
Religious education, who is responsible for that? Is it the job of the church to teach our kids what they need to know? Where does that responsibility lie?
Still lies with the family, right? And so the biblical model would be that the church has a responsibility, if you will, to educate the parents. And the parents have the responsibility to educate the children. Now, again, the parent can delegate that. But when that parent stands before God, God is the one that God is going to hold them accountable, right, for what they delegated.
Yeah, well, how they have used their authority.
Right, right. Just like God will hold the civil government accountable for how it's used its authority, and God will hold elders in the church accountable for how they exercise their authority as well.
We've talked about now the authority in church. We have the elders. We've talked about government. Who's the authority in the family?
Dad.
Dad,
Yeah. And, that goes all the way back to Adam. In fact, it's interesting, and I have to say this is an opinion, all right? So I'll just be really clear about this.
Yep.
But one of the things that I thought was really interesting in Genesis when God makes Eve, and God says, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife. I always thought that was backwards. My understanding was in our culture, right, at least historically, traditionally, when a man and a woman got married, for example, she took his name. So in my mind, she was leaving her family, right, and attaching herself to her husband. I think in Genesis, when God says that, I think what that indicates is it indicates when a man goes out from underneath the authority of his father. So it's understood that the woman moves from the authority of her family into the authority of her husband. But what about the man? When does he become independent of his father? And I think that the indication from that is when he establishes a new household.
Yeah.
Now, there are secondary suggestions. One is, when does he become accountable as an individual before God for his decisions? And there's a hint in Israel's example, again, going back to when they decide whether to enter the land or not at Kadesh Barnea. Those who are condemned to die in the wilderness after 40 years are those who are 20 years of age or older. Those who are under the age of 20 were not held accountable. And so, my speculation is that in addition to, or as an alternative to when a man becomes married, he essentially establishes his own household. There may have also been a sense in which he becomes independently accountable before God for things at the age of 20 or at some, age. And so that's another example of where he becomes independent of the familial authority.
Well, let's talk about family authority. What are the things that fall under the authority of the family? You talked about education being a responsibility of the family. Are there other things that are the responsibility of the family?
Yeah, or I should say maybe are given to the family. Mm-hmm. And I would say that the other major thing is economics. In fact, economics actually comes from a word which has to do with household. And so oikos has to do with household. And that's where we get the word economics from. And if we, again, going back and looking at all the way back from creation, right? The earth and all of its blessing was given not to a state, not to the church. It was given to a family. It was given to Adam and Eve. Okay? Same thing when Noah comes out from the ark. The earth is given to a family. The land of it that Israel was to inherit was given to a family, was given to Abraham. Okay? When Israel enters the land is given by lot to families, and it's given permanently to those families. The state cannot take that land from those families in Israel. It establishes the family as being independent of civil authority or even religious authority. So the whole economic system is based upon the land owned by a family. And that family can never be alienated from the land in Israel. They could never lose the land. Now, they might have to lease it out for a period of time, but even that period of time for which they could lease out the land was temporary. And we have an interesting example during the reign of Ahab and Jezebel, where Ahab sees a plot of land that he'd really like to own. He likes Naboth's vineyard. And he goes to Naboth and said, "Hey, I'd like to buy your vineyard." Naboth says, "No way, this is my family's vineyard, and I'm not going to give it up." And interestingly, Ahab, as wicked as he was still Jewish in his worldview. And so he is pouting around the palace, and because he knows he can't do anything about that. But his wife is not Jewish. His wife comes from Tyre. She's a pagan. And she has pagan ideas about what the king can do. And so she chides him and says, "What do you mean? You're the king. You can do anything you want." And so she arranges for Naboth to be killed so that Ahab can have the land. Because in her mind, there's no limitation on the king. See, in Ahab's worldview, Jewish worldview, as wicked as he was constrained by his worldview that the king can't take that land because it belongs to Naboth. Jezebel has no such constraint. And so the foundation of economics has to be centered around the family, not around civil government. It's not the job of the civil government to manage the economy. It has a responsibility to ensure that contracts are upheld, that we have honest measurements, that the fraud is punished, all of those kinds of things, truth in advertising, okay? All of those kinds of things government has a responsibility for, but it does not have a responsibility to manage the economy.
Economics centers on property. You can't have economic transactions without ownership of what you are transacting.
Right.
So this not only applies to land, it would apply to maybe things like inventions, where the government has patents.
And by the way, that brings up an interesting point, because for the first time in the American Constitution, for the first time, a person's ideas are considered his own property. Prior to the American Constitution, patents were considered to be owned by the king. So if you invented something, the invention belonged to the king, and he could grant you a patent for your idea, but he didn't have to. And the U.S. Constitution is the first legal document that requires the government to protect your invention as your property. So it went from land as the property that you can own,
physical things,
to your ideas are yours as well.
Interesting. Is there overlap? You mentioned a little bit about overlap between church and civil government. If there's a murder in the church, it's the government's job to come in and deal with that. Mm-hmm. It's a legal issue. Is there any overlap between church and family? The church has no power to compel good behavior, so does the church have any authority over the family?
Well, it would have authority in the sense of determining who are members in good standing of the church.
Right. Members of a church? You have to be a member?
Well, because, yes, in the sense that the church can also define who is not a member. In other words, it can excommunicate. All right? And that's what the church does when it finds a member who is living in sin, unrepentant. The church's response to that is not to use the sword. It's church discipline. It's church discipline. It's to excommunicate from the body.
So I do something wrong, they boot me out.
Yep. Now today it doesn't have the same. It doesn't have the same punch as it used to. In other words, if the church was the center, especially when churches are under persecution, the church becomes the center source of your support. Right? It might be actual material support. Right? You lost your job because you're being persecuted, and so the church comes together and it supports you. Well, to be excommunicated from the church had a real consequence. Okay? And so there would be real consequences in that sense. Now, a father, right, has authority over his children, except in the case of, ultimately of child abuse.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Okay? We would make the case that says a father cannot require his wife to have an abortion. All right? The state should be there not to encourage the abortion, but to protect that life.
Yeah.
All right? And so the fathers, none of the human entities have authority which is absolute. It's always circumscribed and held in check. And that goes back to something we said way early on, which is God likes to divide power up.
Okay.
Right?
So now we're seeing it. The ultimate power, is God, but then it's divided among these three groups.
That's right. And if we go back to what Jesus said, right? Jesus said that all authority was his. The only individual that has all authority and is accountable to no one is God. Everything else is what we call derived authority. Everything else is authority which God has granted for specific purposes to support the command that he's given to man to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. And all of these institutions are a part of helping man fulfill that for the glory of God.
So, the authority government has comes from God.
Yep.
And not from themselves. And the authority the church has, the same thing. It comes from God.
Right.
And the authority in the family that the father has, it all comes from God. I think that's a good way to wrap it up. God is the priority. God is the reason why we exist. We're made in his image to glorify him, and we are to glorify him in all that we do. Thank you very much, Doug. I am just so glad you could join us over these 3 sessions. When we first spoke, I asked for just 2 15-minute sessions, and you've given us much more, so we do thank you. This has been very interesting and very important.
Welcome, Steve.
I feel that if we could get this information out and people would act to bring back a biblical government, many of our problems would be solved. So please, if you are watching this on Rumble or YouTube or Facebook, please like this video. That will help this video to rank higher so more people will see it. And please share these videos with others. Here's a link. This link will take people to a web page where they can see all 3 videos. So please share this link on social media. The only way other people will hear about these videos is if you tell them. We really need your help. If you feel like there's nothing you can do to help straighten out the mess we're in, you can do something. You can make a difference, and it's easy. Share this video, share this link, tell others about this video series. My name is Steve. I'm with the Move to Assurance Ministry, and I thank you for watching.